So the following was supposed to be Zion Tamuz in Halachic History, and I did prepare it earlier today, Thursday morning, early noon. However, due to some scheduling conflicts, I'm only recording this late Motzei Zion Tamuz, and will probably be posted early morning Ches Tamuz. But you'll have to forgive me. I hope the topics are interesting regardless. I've already introduced the concept before of looking through Sifrei Shalos Teshuvos for teshuvos that bear today's date, and obviously trying to focus on the interesting ones and explaining why they're interesting. So today we're going to focus first on some old issues surrounding Tikkunei Tshuva, the idea of reaching out to a Rav for tikkun tshuva for severe avera, in this case, actually causing the death of someone, which itself is, if we can say, interesting. Obviously, we don't typically have, there weren't news websites that documented the comings and goings in the Jewish community, but sometimes dafka, the Sifrei Shalos Teshuvos, preserve certain pieces, aspects, slices of life. And in this case, sometimes the extreme incident, a case of a murder, a case of causing someone's death, would be the premise of a question, of a tshuva, and that gets preserved in the Shalos Teshuvos. So this also gives us some insight into that. So we begin with a tshuva from Shalos Teshuvos Even HaShoyam. Now, I'll admit, Shalos Teshuvos Even HaShoyam is not a sefer that I have instant recognition for. Interestingly, though, this is actually a sefer from the which with content with tshuvas from the I guess you could say the late 1600s, and was printed in the early 1700s. So you'd expect it to be more well known, but the truth is there are always svarim from the 15, 16, 17, 18. There are svarim that are famous and svarim that don't make it in the same degree of fame. And Even HaShoyam is, I guess, in that category. But it was printed in the early 1700s, and now there's a new edition from Machain Zichron Aaron. The author is Rabbi Joachim Getz, and apparently was a very German Rav. Seems that he, I believe, grew up in Germany and learned in Germany and was a Sheshiva Rav in Germanic Kehillas, although he ended up ultimately more in the area of Prussia, which was also a Germanic land, but it's besmichas to Poland. And this tshuva itself is from the tkufa that he was the Rav of the city of Schwerzentz. And Schwerzentz today has a Polish name, but it was in that region, the historical region of Prussia, presumably. Joachim Getz lived from 1643 to 1705. And this tshuva is from the year Tuf Mem, so that would be 1680. And it's a small sefer Shalos Teshuvos. It has 66 tshuvas. And the new edition, it's spread over 149 pages. Plus they have other stuff in there, his Toldos, there's a Mafteach, another chibur of his. But we're going to try to keep this short, especially due to the lateness with which this is being recorded. So in Shut Even HaShoyam Simon Mem Hey, we find tshuva that begins with the location and the date. Schwerzentz, Yoim Hey, Zion Tamuz, same kviyas, Tuf Mem, Le Prat Cotton. And this is the question he was asked about. He was asked about a ma'isa that happened on that day. So the ma'isa happened, and he wrote the whole tshuva on that day. And it's interesting to think about, but that's getting technical. At any rate, the ma'isa happened on that day, that someone from this Kehillah in Prussia sent a horse. People own horses. So he sent a horse with a young boy, Nar Cotton. I don't know if that means 9 or 10, perhaps. That's the vibe I get from Nar Cotton. The horse needed to be taken to the water to drink. So he handed the horse over to a Nar Cotton to ride it, which is itself interesting. The relationship between Jews and horses and riding horses. Seems like in the Frumbere Kehillas, I don't know if it was considered appropriate for a Yid to sit and ride a horse, but that probably depended to what extent you were working with horses, and perhaps in smaller Kehillas or places where people were working with livestock, it probably was more common to ride a horse. And in this case, he sent a young boy to ride the horse. As he was riding the horse, his fellow Na'arim Ketanim were chasing it, and they were whacking the horse with a stick under the feet. Mischief, but mischief with some high stakes, because a horse is a pretty fearsome creature, or at least it can be. So they were messing around with him, with the horse, playing games. And along came another Nar Katan, another young boy. But they were striking the horse. The horse was probably kicking, and the one riding the horse is just a young boy himself, and he couldn't fully control the horse. And this other kid, who wasn't even part of the mischief, who came along, the horse ended up kicking this kid, Shabal Fitumai, kicked him in the heart, in the chest, and sadly the child died within half an hour. So there are a number of people here who contributed to this situation. There's the balasos, there's the child on the sus, there's the children who were whacking the sus, but the result of all of their choices is that child's dead, very sadly. And in those days, the shaila immediately was, who has to do teshuva? And there's a rule, Adam muad la'olam, and which is he invokes here, and specifically the horse was a kicker. The horse was known to kick, so that was something that was known to the people, certainly to the owner before. So who's responsible? No, I think we have to pause and explain the premise of the shaila, because I'm not so sure there are shailas and shuvas being written like this today. But we know there's a history of tikkunei teshuva, particularly in the lands of Ashkenaz. Later we know in Tzfas, the Sfaradim also were preoccupied with tikkunei teshuva. But focusing on the Ashkenazi lands, there's a long tradition of tikkunei teshuva, of giving severe tikkunim. We know, look at the Rambam, Lamashal, and there's no such musar, no such concept, l'chayra. Certainly not in a formal prescribed way, but over the generations in the Ashkenazi world, protocols of tshuva were developed and became standard. And then, as we'll see, we'll pick up along the lines here, there was a particular discourse around causing accidental deaths. So every time an accidental death would occur, the shaila would come up again. Who's responsible, and then who should do the tikkunei teshuva, which tikkunei teshuva? So this was something that kept on recurring. And it's interesting, like I said, it's almost like this part of Yiddishkeit has almost vanished. Certainly within Chabad, in the earlier years of the Rebbe, there was this idea you go to the Rebbe to get a tikkun. So the idea of tikkunim sort of got transposed in the Chassidish world to Rebbes, and you had it in Chabad to some extent. People would ask the Rebbe for a tikkun in Yechidus or in a letter, and there are letters of the Rebbe with tikkunim or shimas of Yechidus, stories from Yechidus. Although at this point, what happens now, haven't heard of people asking or looking or applying. Obviously, the Rebbe himself sort of drew down the concept to a certain extent, but that itself really has to be studied. What the Rebbe's approach to tikkunim were. There are many dargas and aspects to tikkunim. The fasting, for instance, it's almost certain that Rebbe would have sort of eliminated that, but there are other things that Rebbe would instruct people to do related to learning Tanya, memorizing Tanya, stuff like that. That's not the focus here right now. Now, when I say it's not with us, surely I think in some parts of the Chassidische world or in Eretz Yisrael, in different circles that identify with Kabbalah, Mekubalim, there certainly is a memory and an ongoing musig of tikkunei teshuva al pi Kabbalah. I'm not directly familiar with it firsthand, but seems reasonable to assume that it's still happening. But what we're seeing here in these sources in particular is that it was in the Amol, in the Ashkenazi world, it was related to the Rav, related to the Paiskim, and it was like a halachic shaila. You turn to the Rav, and the Rav wrote a psak, a teshuva. I think there are some pieces of research that have been written on the topic in the last few decades. One that I came across again, is there's a book, Hatshuva B'Safras Hashut, by Pinchas HaKayin Vilman from the 90s. It's an Eitzer HaChachma, and I think this tshuva, maybe not, I don't know if this tshuva, one of the later tshuvas I have lined up here, is quoted there. So it came up again. So this is a topic. It's an interesting topic, and we're only touching on it from some points, from some aspects here. Previous time that I spoke about it was a bunch of years ago, early years of the Koilel. I did a shir on shichrus, getting drunk in halacha, and some of the Makairis were related to tikkun teshuva for something someone did when drunk. Now, in this case, we're talking about bringing about someone's death, but at least in this case, there was a physical cause of death. But later, I'll quote something about causing death in a more emotional sense, which I think is somewhat more commented. I don't know how common, in terms of actually, until now I was talking about whether people are asking for tikkun teshuva b'chlal, but then more specifically to the question of, are people causing other people's deaths? It's hard to think of too many examples where someone today would feel that they literally caused someone's physical death, although could still happen. But I think the number of accidents and incidents involving death were probably much higher. Once upon a time, people could go through a forest and get killed. People could go on a ship and drown. It's a lot less likely now. So I don't know how often you have these types of shilas. And okay, sometimes you have a car accident, someone runs over a kid. These things do have been known to happen. And then everyone says, oy vey, we feel terrible. Today we almost feel terrible for the emotional damage that might cause the person who will feel responsible. And that's maybe the biggest punishment, and that's how we would see it today. So I don't know if they're asking for tikkun teshuva, but maybe they would. Maybe they would feel so devastated. They would ask for tikkun teshuva. We just don't hear about it. I don't know. But attributing someone's death to emotional harm that was dealt to them maybe is a bit more common, and we'll get to that a bit later. At any rate, this was the shaila that Rabbi Yaakov Getz, the Baal Shut Even Hashayim, was asked. And you have a number of people you can point the finger at. So he begins by citing a Gemara about if you sick a dog on someone. And as usual, in these types of scenarios, the halacha is Pater Medini Adam, Chayev Medini Shemayim. Why Pater Medini Adam? Because it's grama. And this is a big yisoid in this whole discussion, whereas in the Western law that we're familiar with today, you have concepts of proximate cause, manslaughter. So someone who sets a murderous situation, a deathly situation into motion, even if they didn't land the deadly blow, they will certainly find counts on which to convict them. But in halacha, seemingly we find that if it's grama, even if you created a Rube Goldberg machine that's going to result in certain death, but if it's grama, if it's not direct, halacha draws a very sharp line and says that you're pater medini adam, chayav b'dinei shemayim, even if you sat and you planned it, but if it's set up with grama, you're pater b'dinei adam. So this point is a central point in these discussions regarding tikkun teshuva as well. However, you are chayav b'dinei adam, b'dinei shemayim, so tikkun teshuva is sort of the territory of dinei shemayim anyway. But this grama point is relevant to these discussions. Now, in the halachas in Shulchan Aruch, there is this idea that the Baal HaKelev, if he sicked his dog, could be chayav b'chatzi nezek, because he knew what he's doing, but it doesn't seem like that's mamash chiyuv b'dinei adam. Maybe I didn't look it up, and maybe that's just something Rishonim said along the way, so it became like a din. So he makes the tzushtal and says, in this case, just like if the person knows that the dog bites, and you're sicking the dog, so what do you expect? So in this case, the Baal Sus knew that the sus kicks, even when it's in the Rishus HaRabim. Or even though it's Rishus HaRabim and he has Rishus, it's not like he's not allowed to, it's not irresponsible to take his horse out, but if you know that the horse kicks, so you should never have handed the horse to begin with to a child who can't control it. And that's if you want to compare it to the Kelev. And even if you don't go all the way down that road, but it's grama, and we have evidence that when it comes to tikkun teshuva, grama, you have to be makabel tikkun teshuva. I just said it's sort of like chayav b'dinei shemayim, but there's a raya specifically, as we'll see in a second. So the Baal Sus is chayav tikkun teshuva, And the children who are hitting the horse are also somewhat like the one who sicks the dog. In this case, it's not the bala kelev or the bala sus, it's the kid. So they also have to be mekabel tshuva. Because all the poskim, rishonim and acharim, they all talk about that. Misha garam beretzicha chayev b'tshuva. And he rattles off a bunch of names. Maram Lublin, Mari Vail, Marshal, Masas Binyamin, they all talk about this. It's not even mitzvah to the individual samana, but anyone who's familiar with the subject would be familiar, recognize, right, these are the Makaidas. What's the big raya? What's the big raid? What was the raid in these teshuvas? The big raya was, and there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told David that Al Yodcha Neharag Doeg V'Achitoifel V'Noiv Ira Koyanim V'Shal. And now I'm noticing that the text I'm looking at actually has a typo. It says Ushloime, and that's obviously not correct. It's supposed to say Ushloisha Banav, and 3 of Shaul's sons. So David, you go through the story in Tanakh, and there's a lot of obviously there's a lot of drama and there's a lot of death. But here the Gemara really lines it up and says, look how many people in David's vicinity got offed. Doeg, Achitoifel, the whole city of Noiv, Shaul, his sons. All these people died, and David has a hand in it. So you have a big aveda. So now you have a choice: either your children will be decimated, or you'll be handed over to the enemy. So that's the ma'aseh over there. So we see from this. So this is the big raya that all these poskim cited, that even though is David chayav, was David pesheya? No, but somehow he kept on causing these takalas to occur. And that was enough for him to be punished. Hashem Amish was going to give him a severe punishment. And there's the whole ma'aseh of being handed over to the enemy. What happened? Mari Vail cites this taka as a raya to what became a common question, was that, as I mentioned before, often going on the roads, going through forests, going over the water, could be deadly. And often people had shluchim for business, for other missions, sort of they were sent on someone else's behalf, and then the shliach died on the way, and then so the mishaleach bears some culpability, some responsibility. So the Mari Vail made this big yisoid that a shliach shenarag b'derech, a mishaleach chayav la'asas tshuva. And Evan Hashem says, Yu'in Sham b'chol tshuva sheves. Look at all the tshuvas, which again he wasn't mitzvah to directly, but look at all those famous tshuvas. So kol shekin kal v'chaymer, but in Didan, it's the same yisoid that they were mamish whacking the horse, or even the balasos. They have this culpability, so not different than David, whose responsibility. Now, Evan Hashem starts saying, wait a second, is this taka a good raya? Is the tzushtal to David a good tzushtal? Because the big thing that David's responsible for is Noiv Ira Koyanim, that he caused Noiv Ira Koyanim to be killed by Shaul. But in the story there's a line there where David says that I knew Doeg was going to tell Shaul. So if David knew that Doeg is going to tell, if he knew that Doeg is a maser, so Shaitan Shulchan Aruch by Dinah Mesira, that usually ein shliach l'dvar avera. But if the Meshaleach knows that the Shliach is going to maser, then the Meshaleach does have responsibility. What's the technical reason? He says the B'sheis brings some attachments that ein shliach l'dvar avera is only by a yid, but a maser can yid b'chala. We don't treat a maser like a yid. So if a Meshaleach sends someone who ends up masering, so we don't treat the maser like a yid. And Mamela, the Meshaleach is a Meshaleach l'dvar avera, so he is Chayiv. So David was like the Mishaleach or the Goydem to Mesira, so it's nicht kein raya. But then he says, that the other end of the Mesira, the recipient, in this case was Shaul. And we talk about Mesira, usually Mesira is to Nisht Yid, but here the Mesira was to Shaul. And Shaul ultimately had to listen to Doeg and had to make the decision. So Yabazoi, it's not like a regular Mesira. Here, the real responsibility, the final responsibility, is really Shaul's. So, Mamela, weiter, Stamazo, you shouldn't consider David Chayev. And Shaul Taka was held responsible, Taka considered an avera for Shaul. So we see that Shaul is the main culprit. And Afal PK, and the Gemara is saying that David is responsible. So weiter, so our raya is back. The raya from the Gemara is back that David really shouldn't be held responsible. And Afal PK, he was held responsible, so that proves that in a case like this as well, where you might even be chayav b'dinei adam, depending on, I guess, the comparison to the dog and the chatzi nezek. So if you would consider shtikl chai b'dinei adam, so for sure you need to have teshuva because of this din mishasa. So kol shekain here chayav b'dinei shemayim, but tzarich l'takim b'teshuva needs to do teshuva. So nidar is daiti the kabbalah of teshuva kasher matzinu b'teshuva sakadmoinim asher atzim lefanachas. So this has to continue in the tradition of the kadmoinim of the teshuvas that they would dole out to people in these situations. Then he's chayzer and he wants to bring more rayas that the Baal HaSus, the owner of the sus, is also chayav. But we're going to keep it short. Let's not get into all the pratim, all the weeds. The idea comes across pretty clearly that the Baal HaSus has certain responsibility and the Ketanim have certain responsibility. Elamai, there's a question about being mechayev the Ketanim. The question is whether Ketanim have any responsibility for what they do. And he has a right, and it could be this is talking not so common, even in this literature, which at that point was pretty large. It clearly was an established sugya in the Achreinim, but perhaps the prat of if those responsible are Ketanim, perhaps that prat had not been fully fleshed out before. So he wants to prove that even the young boys with the mischief would also be chayav to mekabel teshuva when they grow up. It says in Ohr HaChaim Siman Shemim Gimel that a child who hits his parents or does other avedas, even though they don't need teshuva when they grow up, but it's still good to be mekabel apis ezu davar l'teshuva l'kapara. So that means that lefia din potter. I mean, you can take that to mean either thing. It says they don't, but it says it's good. So he's starting with the point that it says you don't. And the Makar is from Piskei Maharai, the Trumas Hadashin, which he says he doesn't have the original source. Then he gets into he wants to make a raya from the Gemara about Yeshiyahu, Matinuik ben Shalishanam, and Bechet. I don't want to get into the whole back and forth, but he's trying to figure out, if he had done Averos when he was a kid, would he have been Chayav Tshuva or not be Chayav Tshuva? And then he, interestingly, the Even HaShoyam brings Kabbalah into it. That even if you say you have to do tshuva, but the Baal Asar Mamoris, the Ramah Mifano already explained in the Toras HaGulgulim, in the whole sugya, the whole musig of Gulgulim, which was introduced by the Rizal, but Ramah Mifano has a very systematic discussion that Yeshio was the Gilgul of Achaz. So in Achanami he was doing tshuva. There's a pasuk. The pasuk says, "Lo hayamalach sheshav al Hashem, kamayu lo hayamalach sheshav al Hashem b'chol libay." That's the premise of the discussion. On the one hand, Ben Shalish Shanim, and the one says he didn't have any Avedas, and yet he did tshuva. What's he doing tshuva for? So you want to bring a raya that you do have to bring tshuva? No, it's not raya because he's a gilgul of acha, so that's why he's doing tshuva. So that's a raya that kids don't have to do tshuva for things they did when they were kids. But no, it's not a raya. Yeshio was such a tzaddik that he didn't do any Avedas when he was a kid. So Memela is nishkein raya that if you do Avedas, you don't have to do tshuva because he didn't do Avedas. So he didn't do Avedas, so he didn't have to do tshuva for that, but he had to do tshuva for being a gilgul of achaz. But so it's nishkein raya hin or her. But if a child were to do Avedas, we could still say that they should take tikkun tshuva when they grow up. Then he gets into a whole discussion this Gemara Baba Kama that one Amida forced another Amida to pay for a shtar that they had burned in their childhood. We're not going to get into that whole sugya. He has a lot of discussion there. We have to be mekatzer here. But his takeaway from there is that lefnim yishur sadin, even a cotton when he grows up should be lots of sitei shemayim to pay. And ultimately, his takeaway is that from the whole back and forth, that you have to do tshuva when you grow up, and even according to the Shulchan Aruch, you have to do tshuva for other avedas, call it koshken kavachemer, for a big avera like this, shvichas damim. I don't know if we did justice to the intricacies and the backs and forths and the rayas and of course it's interesting to approach the sugya like that. Sometimes I myself like to zoom out and use larger logical principles. Either way, it seems like there's a basis. If you go with the whole mahalach of tikkun tshuva, it seems fair to say there's a basis to tell people. And the question is, what do you mean by chayav anyway? You have the Shulchan Aruch sometimes saying that you don't have to, but you should. So, okay, so by that standard, sounds like as a Rav, you could tell the person that you should. What does should mean? It's sort of relative anyway. At any rate, his maskana was that the cotton kishi yigdal, not sure if he actually means, now we're talking about the child riding the horse, that he didn't seem to focus on, unless I missed something. Maybe Hitaka means the children who hit the horse, who certainly were more responsible than the child on the horse, who just was in over his head. He couldn't have done anything differently. But he writes a Lashon Yachid, the cotton Kashiyigdal, they should go to the caver of the victim and ask Mechila in front of 10 people with a crying voice. I actually saw someone just asked recently, do we find Mekairis where halacha or svarim say that you should cry, you should make yourself cry? And I said, I think the Fidik Rebbe talks about how there was I don't know if anyone's ever found it, but that there was a machzer in Prague, that's by the Tfilos Yom Neiraim, it said somewhere, Kan Tzarech Livkais. Even if it did say that, when it's reduced to that, it sounds like almost like a joke, but you have the famous line from the Rizal, Kol mi she'eni boiche, in the Seres Teshuva, Ein Nishmas Shlema. So the idea that a sefer would say that you should cry is not so weit, not so abgefragt. And here he says you have to ask for mechila bekoil bechia with a veinendike stimme, and you have to mekabel galus. What does that mean? You have to go every week, one day, barefoot in the field, and cry. I have to cry again. Asher inu alekim liyadoi, and like the Rashi says, mashal kadmoini, that mirisham tetzei resha. And for a whole year, whichever year this is going to be when he grows up, usually it would be the immediate year for an adult, but here it's going to have to be sometime in the future. For Meshach Shana, every Chodesh, Yom Kippur Katan, which is a whole sugya b'fnei atzma, should do say vidui in front of 3 people, and give him malchus, and should fast for a whole year and do teshuva, and also for the rest of his life he should always fast a day that this Maisa happened, which we said was Taka this day. He said this Maisa happened on this date, so Zayin Tamuz, and be marbet tefillah and stuck as much as he can on that day for himself, and then the neshama of the mace, like almost like keeping a yard site. And after all of that, then we'll say Ashrei Ziknusei Shemechaper Al Yildusei Makom Shabbat Tshuva Imdim into Dikin Gum Yechayim Lamed Shalom Yilonu L'Chol Yisrael Ne'um L'Yakim HaMachuna Gets. So if these tikkun tshuva sound extreme to you, so I think that's just an indication that you should familiarize yourself more with this literature, because it's not particularly unusual or exceptional. Now, Me'inyan Le'inyan, he was Mitzayin earlier that this Maram Lublin, so I want to quote some of the related tshuvas in this literature that are interesting. So Maram Lublin, maybe this is the famous one. I didn't go check if there are others, but in Maram Lublin, Shut Maram Lublin, Simimam Dalad, there's a Maise Mavil. This is what he writes: Dvar HaMikra Bilti Tohar, Shakara Bekilas Kodesh Brisk Delita. As we know, Amol, there were 2 Brisks apparently. There was a Brisk more in Polish territory, and there was the Brisk in Lithuanian territory, which is the famous Brisk that we all know. But this is back to a Tkufa where Poil and Lita were more unified. It wasn't like Poil and Lita were 2 different planets. And we know that there were Rabbanim who were Rabbanim and Lita, and then back in Poland and back in Lita. This is back in the Tufs, or the early Tuf Kufs maybe still. So this is a Maisa that happened in Brisk the Lita to the Goyin Rebbeinish of Brisk. What's the Maisa that happened? The Mikra Bilti Torah that happened to the Goyin Rebbeinish of Brisk. He writes, HaMaisa Shahaya Kishahaya. What's the Maisa? What happened? He says, the man that happened, that was involved, the other party to the story, he came to us, to Lublin, I guess, to report the Maisa, which itself would be interesting. If the Maisa happened in Brisk, and he came to Lublin, that itself maybe tells us something about how things were operated in those days. But he came to tell us, he had to, as we'll see what he did, he came to be Mekabel Din. So the Maisa was that he came to knock on the door of the Rav. Rabbeinish was the Rav of Brisk Delita. He came to knock on the door of Rabbeinish of Brisk. Why? He wanted to intervene. He wanted to intercede on behalf of a young man, a nar, I would guess in this context, maybe a teenager, or oldest maybe very early 20s, a nar from his family and his friends. There'd been some psak from the Rav regarding this nar, and he was coming to speak up on his behalf. He came knocking. The Rav, Rabbeinish, sensed that this man was related to this Nar who had just received this Psak, and he sensed that this man is probably coming to the Rav in connection to that. But the Rav, according to the way the story was told, completely overreacted, and he thought that this guy is coming to get the Rav, that this guy is flown into a rage, and he's going to do who knows what to the Rav. And the Rav Rabbanish panicked, and he locked himself into the room, and he picked up a heavy box, Nasa Teva Achas Masa Kaved, and he placed it in front of the door, and he was barricading himself inside the room, and all of this excitement caused him to fall ill. And even though he seemed to recover, like he uses the lashon that achayim yemayim, he uses halach mishante b'chutz, and there was a non-Jewish doctor that was tending to him, but at the end he passed away. This is what happened. And though the person that was the other party to this incident, it's dvarav b'fanenu be'is shebala kabel dinai. So this we see how they treated such. How these incidents were taken very seriously, and the person clearly understood that he had to go get a psak to mekabel dim. So, like I said, part of the context here is the Poilin and Lita being more of one larger region, even though they did distinguish. But at some point, the Vaad Arbaratzis seemed to cover both, and I think my impression is that the cultural differences that came to define these regions later had not fully set in. There was more of it was seen as more of the same spectrum of people. Then with time, I think the stereotypes and the differences and the distinctions set in. And so I guess it would make sense that if the person had done something in Brisk that he would come to Lublin, which is where often the Vaad Arba Aratzis would gather in the different Yeridim in Lublin. So maybe that was taka the reason why he went all the way to Lublin to get the psak from the Gedolim, from the Manhigim. That would be my assumption. What else do we know about the Rabbanish of Brisk? Not much. His name is mentioned in a few different Svarim, often to talk about his descendants or who he was married to. And Svarim say that he was an Edom by Reb Shaul Vaad, the legendary Reb Shaul Vaad. I don't know if that's true. But often when they refer to him, they say, Rabbanish of Brisk, the one mentioned in Shut Maram Lublin, Selim Dal. So that's his claim to fame, is this peculiar incident. But from the Maram Lublin's Lashon, it sounds like he was talking from the Chashav Gedolim, the Goin, Marina Rav Rabbanish Zal. So as I alluded to earlier, though, what's interesting about this scenario is that this is nothing like the horse scenario. This is literally causing some kind of distress to the person. And I actually did, this reminded me that I once gave a share on this, which is, like I said, somewhat more common. People will say, "Oi, this person, they treated him however they treated him, or they had a job, they lost their job, they lost their stella, and they got akbas nefesh," and then they'll say, "Oh, look," and then within a short time, he passed away. They killed him. So I once spoke about this, and there's the question of, can you be teveya? Is this something you could be teveya b'din? And the answer seems to be that maybe you would consider it baishas, you would put it into the framework, the category of baishas, and we don't have that halachic category. We're not danned in baishas, and the whole tort of emotional distress in the common sense that we're familiar with in America today was sort of invented in California in the 60s. There's more of an evolution to it, but in, like I said, in the common sense that we're familiar with, that you sue for emotional distress is a late chiddush. But really, I focused on that aspect then. But really, here we see there's another aspect, which is that would you be chay b'dinei shemayim? And amal, if someone was responsible, especially in such a direct way, would they give tikkunei teshuva the way they did to someone who was goydem ritzicha? So that itself makes this question, I think, more interesting. And Maram Lublin said that, in my opinion, ein leish hazeh klal din ritzayach, and not even gram misa, because he did not do a thing. And he immediately makes the same analogy to the dog, and it's not like shisa boyas hakelav. or other examples where you do something where you tie someone up and something bad's going to happen. Because that's a grama. You did something, but there's a grama. So it's nicht daher, nicht daher. Here, to be fair to this guy, he didn't do anything that he didn't do half. You tie someone up, so you did half a maisa, and then the other half happens on its own. Here, his contribution was, objectively speaking, not a contribution to a death. Taka says in Gemara that if someone surprises, terrifies, does something to his chaver, hamavis his chaveroi, so taka potter b'dinei adam, it's grama, etc., but chay b'dinei shemayim. So chay b'dinei shemayim, like I've said, I don't know if it's been stated clearly, but presumably if you're chay b'dinei shemayim, that would probably be a good raya that you're probably chay into teshuva. So ma'avis is chaveroi chay b'dinei shemayim. Says here, the guy terrified himself. The guy worked himself. The Rav, not the guy. The Rav worked himself into terror. It's not fair to all this guy was doing was coming to knock on the door to have a conversation, according to by his own report, by his own account. So that means that the Rav terrified himself. But then he says, but he had a hand in it. So that brings us back to the medieval of Mashaleach sends a guy on a shlichus, and then the guy gets killed on the shlichus. The Mashaleach also did nothing irresponsible, and it's Ma'aser Sheb Choyam, you send the shliach. But Marival said, and here he quotes the Lashon, that Eich shebishlichuscha nerag Rabbi Zarya Hashem yikim dami. That was the case with Marival, that the shliach was Rabbi Zarya, and he was killed, and connected by Nish Yidden, so Hashem yikim dami. And Marival quotes this Gemara, David, Yodcha, Nerag, Doeg, Achitophel, Never Akainim, Shol, Gemubanov. So we see that even David HaMelech was not Pishaya, but it's through him, and he was punished. So the Marival said, Kol Shekain Hacha, you sent him on Shlichus, so Ikulamechash, that you're facing an Einish Yisurim, so you should Mekabel Yisurim on yourself, like a fast for 40 days, etc. So that's the precedent. That's the precedent that all these Svarim are dealing with. That's what Marival said there. So if the Meshaleach, who innocently sent the Shliach, is held somewhat liable. So the guy who walked over to the Rav's house and sent the Rav into a fit of terror, rises to the same standard that he's responsible to a similar extent. So it's the Mechalik. There, the Nerag bears no responsibility. The Nerag was just going on his merry way. And the Meshaleach is the one who sent him, so there's more Meshaleach involvement and less blame you could place directly on the Shliach. And the same goes for David's victims. David's victims were just carrying about their lives, and David set things into motion that caused them. Mashenkin here, it's like hard to attribute anything to this guy. All he's doing is walking down the street and then knocking on the door, and it all happened in the Rav's mind. And now he brings a raya from the Marshal. Now, until now, we keep on seeing tshuvas that keep on taking a stringent view on these types of questions. But now we finally get to see one that's more lenient. He says, a better case that the Marshal Taka was his tshuvah, Simon Tzadik Vav, was asked about a case where some guy was chasing a kid to Hakoisoi, Uliyasroi. I'm going to get you. I'm going to beat you up. Who knows what the kid did? Who knows what happened? Maybe it says in the Marshal. I don't know. The guy was chasing him to grab him by the neck, and the kid was running, and he fell into a guma, some kind of small hole in the ground, but big enough that he could fall into it. And there was water at the bottom, and he fell in, and he drowned. So they came to the Marshal. They said, this guy chased this kid. The kid fell, tripped, drowned. And the Marshal said, no tshuva, no tikkun tshuva. It's all the kid's fault. The kid, Gilgal Hamisala Atzma. Who forced him to jump into the guma? He's being chased. He should have been looking. So the Marshal took a very pragmatic approach. You're not chayav. No, clearly, I think if we compare these Makaitis to each other, clearly that I think the Marshal is just on a different track, taking a different tack here than some of these other Makaitis. It could be he just wasn't good as the premise as much as others. Because certainly these other Makaitis that we're looking at, Mari Vile, it sounds like they would have been Mechayiv Tikkun Tshuva in that scenario. So Maram Lublin is going back and forth, though, and it is like a sort of a funny case. We're like, what did this guy even do? But based on this whole picture, he says, because this guy is chayshish and he wants to be mekabel Anshel Yisurim, he came all the way from Brisk to Lublin, it seems. And they use the same line that so I'll give him dark teshuva. And here are the dark teshuva. And okay, brace yourselves, because again, it's not if you're not used to this, it's not what you're expecting. So this is what he says. First of all, you have to fast 40 days straight. That's for starters. That's for appetizers. Then afterwards, he has to fast 3 days each week and not eat meat and not drink not only wine, not even beer. Chol yom hatainis though. So then it sounds like, okay, so is it a full tainus or just a tainus in that sense? Okay, whatever. And he can't sleep on pillows and mattresses or blankets for a whole year except Shabbos and Yom Tov. And he shouldn't wash his body and he shouldn't shampoo his head only once a month. As soon as he returns to Brisk, from Lublin again presumably, he should lie at the threshold of the shul when people leave the shul and let everyone step on him. And he should sit for an entire year behind the door of the shul, which itself is sort of a nebuchadnezzar thing to do. And, or I guess maybe that means he can't, maybe it means during davening, that he has to sit during davening behind the door. And every month, he has to go once a month with 10 people and lie, b'mishtateach, on the kever hagoyim, b'vchia, again, prescribing the crying and the screaming, and ask mechila, and he should do this for 12 full months after the 40 days. Initially, everything else is for the rest of the duration of the 12 months. And he shouldn't attend any suda and any simcha and any tiyul, schoik, tainug for an entire year. And after that, he should fast every bahab until 3 years conclude. And he shouldn't, but again, it sounds like maybe the fasting means that he shouldn't drink any sheikher, and certainly not mead and yayin saraf, derech shichrus. That's for 5 years. So that's two separate things. He should fast bahab for 3 years, and b'chalal, he shouldn't drink sheikher, any alcoholic beverage. Certainly, sheikher is a weaker one. Certainly not the hard alcohol, the hard liquor, derech shichrus, for 5 years. Not at a suda, not in his house. After he leaves shul, the shamash should give him private malchus, 40 malchus every day. Every yom beis, every Monday. That means once a week for those 12 months. And after he does all of this, geyser, b'gzeres seinu, hakash, gzeres nachash. That's what you gain after all that is that if anyone ever brings it up again and calls him ritzeach, apparently that was a concern that if you don't do the tikkun teshuva, then people get to call you ritzeach, and then you can't complain, hey, they're calling me ritzeach. But if you do all this, then if someone calls you ritzeach, then they're going to be in cherem. So they're using their power. And in the next tshuva I'm going to quote, you'll see about the powers of the Vaad in Lublin. So he's using the force of the power of the Vaad to say that now you have our protection. So that's the tshuva Maram Lublin, which I think is very interesting in many ways and provides additional context for how these discussions went. Another source that I wanted to cite in this context, it also focuses on this David and Doeg, this Zerayah from the Gemara, is in the Bach, Shut Bach HaChadashos. And I guess this will have to be Mekatzer, but it's a fascinating, because it's not really a tshuva, it's really more of an igeres and a letter. And it's a fascinating letter to the manhige, the Vaad at the Yerid Lublin, and it sounds like the Bach himself is not there, and the dynamics here are fascinating. That he's reaching out as a gadol to the manhigim at the Vaad in the Yerid Lublin, and he says, "I already sent you a letter." It sounds like at the previous Yerid Kislev Shin Pei Beis, which would be 1622. I already have reached out to you, and now I'm reaching out to you again. And basically, he writes Barichas that year there were terrible events that happened. That on the Rechoiv HaYehudim Lublin, and the Yiddish Gas in Lublin, there was an attack where robbers and other local youths, Reikim Peichzem, attacked the Jewish street. And they robbed them, they looted, they took all the kesef and the zahav. So we're seeing this tzaras. And the Bach is saying, I think it's the manhigim's fault. They're the goyim ben azakim. because they keep on being machrim. They kept at the Yidid in Lublin, they kept on being machrim all the Yechidim that are just sort of spread out individually in different cities. So it's not fully clear. One would have to delve deeply into understand the Metzias exactly. We're talking about Yechidim that live where Jews don't live, or something else, or Yechidim that are sort of outside of the Kehillah, they're just sort of operating on their own, something in that sense. So there was something that was undermining the Seder HaToiv of how the Kehillahs were run. So in order to crack down on it, they use the one tool that they love to use is the cherem. Whoever doesn't follow the instructions, cherem. Problem is that they were fighting against gravity. Whatever these people were up to was the draw was too powerful, and they were ignoring the cherem. Just because there's a cherem doesn't mean that people take it seriously, which itself is an interesting historical observation. That not every takana, not every cherem was matzliach. And not just they are not treating the cherem seriously, but even tzaddikim yirei maybe he's implying that they also weren't respecting the cherem, but everyone's getting punished as a result. So you're creating a cherem, the cherem is not being observed, so then we deserve to be punished. He says, and instead of learning from your mistake, you're doubling down. He says, now you were machrim again, and you used 7 Sifrei Torah, so you're like trying to make the cherem even more severe. He says, if I'm honest with Yeshua, that Yeshua made a cherem on Yerichai, to take the bizu of Yerichai, and Hashem tells him, it's your fault, you shouldn't have answered it, because also you're fighting against gravity. It's a scenario where people want to take, and they're going to fight on the cherem. So you see, when you create a cherem, that people are going to be nichshel in the cherem, so you're actually at fault for starting the cherem, and then there'll be, just like by Yerichai, there'll be, or by Ai, there'll be tzaras as a result. And he brings other rayas, and one of the things he mentions is David, that David was responsible. So Kal v'chomer within the Dan, that ain't suffix through the chomer the cherem, because you made this new severe cherem. That's why Yidden were killed, and that's why Yidden nitredu min ha'olam b'dalas u'b'shiflas. People were being afflicted in terrible ways with poverty. That pshita de'ikal amecha shehagurmim chas v'shalom yagiu la'onish yisurin. He's saying you're causing all of this, so then you're going to be facing onish yisurin, just like in the previous teshuvas, that someone who's goyim, just like anyone who you can compare it to David and to Doeg and the other people he was responsible for. So the implication of the Gemara is that they face a punishment. So anyone who's goyim, Misa, Meshaleach, Marivai, all of these scenarios are facing onish yisurin. And Mamela, and then he quotes Taka straight away. He quotes Marivai that Mishal Yadesh Lichaser Bedarach Nerag. So the Bach is making a very straight forward parallel tzushtel, but this is like an even more abstract version of it. I think in these three teshuvas, the first one they hit the horse hit the kid. The second one, the guy knocked on the Rav's door and the Rav panicked. And here they're passing charamim, which people are going to be nichshel in, and then they'll be punished. And then because they passed a cherem that caused people to be punished, so then they'll be punished. So the Bach is also tying that it's all in the same category. And then he goes on to say that I don't think you even had the standing and the right to make a cherem on the klal without the haskama of the gedolei hachacham, even though you're the chosen ones, and there was a whole semi-democratic system for how you were appointed from all the kehillas. But it could be your whole cherem is ishkan cherem, and he brings rayas. That's a whole sugya that you have to have an adam chashuv. So he says, for example, in your scenario, in Lublin, you have Reb Shmuel Sagal, Av Beistin, V'reish Mesifta of Lublin, so he should have been part of the discussion, and then maybe. But I think a cherem that is binding all the kehillas in the malchus isn't binding unless all the gedolim shebadar lefachos from the big kehillas are mishtatef. So you also have sort of the part of the halachic discussion here is how these charamas are supposed to work, and there are always analogous discussions today. Not with cherem isn't used anymore, but the doilim coming out with takanas, and what's the process? There has to be some kind of process. And there has to be some kind of representation. He says, you're going to tie that I'm saying two contradictory things. The first half I was saying that because you passed this cherem, so you're being machshel everyone, and now I'm telling you that the cherem is nishkin cherem. So you're going to, don't use that teretz to say that, this kalkala is a takana. The cherem is nishkin cherem. So bazoi, no one's getting punished. No. Even though I, the Yechidei Skula, know that the cherem is Ishkin cherem, but the Hamoinam doesn't know that. The Hamoinam thinks the cherem is a cherem, and they think that they're fighting on the cherem. So they need kapara lefi havana sam. And then he returns to this point that those who were masking to the cherem, they are now have to be choshesh for Yisurin, just like the Marival says by the Mishaleach who sends the Shliach. So what we need to do is we need to be matir the charamas, use a Pesach v'charata, whatever process there is to be matir and oiker a cherem, to be oiker lemafreya. That way the oynish cherem isn't in play, and there were people who violated this takan and the cherem. They shouldn't get off scot-free. Whoever was over, they should have other punishments. Clearly, we see that back in the day, they didn't lack for creative ways to punish people. So we can figure out how to punish them in other ways, but just stop using the cherem, he says. Now he addresses the motives for the cherem. He says, I understand what your kavanah was. Your kavanah was to protect the Jewish community, because these yechidim, whatever they're up to, can end up causing harm. They're these lone actors. They're doing stuff that may not be acceptable to the authorities. So labal yagia chamas hamelech ala klal kulei. That was where you were coming from. He says, in a certain way, this is similar to the discourse about someone who promises never to gamble again, which was also a big sugya for many hundreds of years. You had the people that struggled with gambling, and then they would use a neder, and then they would basically come and say, look, I'm being over the neder anyway, so please help me be matir the neder, so at least I'm not being over on the neder. And there are some Mekaydas that say that you should be matir the neder of Kuvi, even though it's a neder for a thing that you shouldn't be doing, so you can't be matir a neder for a thing that you shouldn't be doing anyway. But the draw is so powerful, so they can't help themselves. So there are sources, there are voices in halacha that say that you should be matir it. So the same thing goes for here. Gambling is terrible, and what these guys, these yechidim, are up to, whatever business dealings they have, is also that's harmful to the klal. But clearly, just like gambling is a compulsion, the people here, it's also a compulsion. They can't hold themselves back. They're looking for parnas, they're looking for a revach. And here he mentions that they're involved, but asik chiluf hamatbeis and is chadish they feel compelled to get involved into this coin exchange that was unfortunately invented in this generation, which sounds interesting. I don't know if there's any clear discussion of this anywhere. I would have to go look, and obviously this is just a secondary teshuva to what we started with. But very interesting what he's describing. It's like a real interesting slice of life. Like I said, it's like half teshuva, half igeres. Anyway, we have to be mekatzer, and there's like another page of this teshuva, but we're just going to skip all of it. You get the point. And so get rid of the cherem, and this is in the shut Bach HaChadashos, and at the end it says, Huatak miguf ksivas yad hagoyin marina arav Reb Yoel Baal Bach, which is an interesting postscript. This was copied from the original Ksav Yad of the Bach. So fascinating letter. Ought to be more well known. There's a lot going on here. This gives you a taste, some of the flavor for this topic. But just to quickly provide some more perspective, first of all, the Even HaShayim himself that we started with, Yakim Getz, he has another teshuva, a few semanim early, Simon Mem, where he was asked about another incident where there was a lady who wanted to go to shul, and she asked the younger girl who worked in the house to look after the baby. In the end, the baby unfortunately was not in the crib, but on the mother's bed, and flipped over and died. So to Kunei Tshuva, a similar discussion: who's responsible? Is it the mother? Is it the girl? And that actually reminded me that Nittel, earlier this year, I recorded something on the other channel, and among other things, I mentioned about a certain kuntris that was once very popular in the 1600s and was mamash like a handbook to popular Avedis, and I think popular Tikkunei Tshuva, and you get to see what the popular Avedis were that people wanted Tshuva for, and one of them actually is if a woman, a mother, is responsible for an infant's death accidentally. That's one of the Avedas there. So that's somewhat related to what the Even Hashem is talking about. But interestingly, this discourse still continued in the 1700s, and even in the 1800s, we still find. So I found the Noda B'Yehuda, Madura Kamer Chaim Simla Madalad, has a case also of a Meshalech and a Shliach, but in that case, the Meshalech didn't send the Shliach. The Shliach was a Zaken, and he came begging, please give me the Shlichus, I want to take Schreira for you. And the Meshalech's wife said, you're old, it's not, and there's war, there's soldiers, it's dangerous, and he was begging and pleading. So they gave him the Schreira, and he went and he was killed. So the Noda B'Yehuda says, yeah, this is mighty vile, and anyway, but the Noda B'Yehuda Taka, more in the vein of the Marshal, says, I don't think you're chayav. Not only that, he comes up with an interesting chap. Everyone keeps bringing rayas from David, but he says, look at the list. The list has Doeg, Achitophel, Noiv, Shol, Shosh's Banov, but there's one person who's not on the list. Who's not on the list? Avner. Now, Avner also was killed because of David. He came to Chevron to be Keres Brisk, and then Yoav killed Avner. And David had been part of it. David said, come to him. And yet Avner is not on the list. Zak the Noda B'Yehuda, you know why Avner is not on the list? Because Avner initiated. Avner is the one who reached out to David first. So Derech Zeh, if the Shliach reaches out to the Meshalech first, so then it's not the Meshalech's fault at all. I don't know if the Marty Weil, again, I don't know if the Marty Weil would have agreed with this logic. It doesn't seem so likely. Madame Lublin with the logic there with the Rav, whose fault it is. Okay, there the Rav didn't initiate, but the Rav almost initiated everything, was all in his own head. Noda B'Yehuda Taka took a more lenient stance, but he also ended up and said, oil, that the Rav Jekila said you do need kapara, so I don't want to go against your Rav. So fast 3 days Bahab, which compared to these other lists of things is, you could say, a slap on the wrist. But that was Noda B'Yehuda wanted to respect the Rav, so the local Rav, okay, so fast 3 days. But we keep finding, even like I said, even in the 1800s, there's a tshuva in the Divrei Chaim. I don't think we should get into the details, but here is more another accident, more in the vein of what we started with, of the horses got out of control and they killed a child. This one ends up being more straightforward, based on Marival, based on the David and the Doeg. You should be Mekabel the Tshuva, the Masas Binyamin, and he gives this whole list, also pretty harsh list. So you see that as late as the Divrei Chaim, he was still doling out these traditional tshuvas, the tshuvas, here he's been signed to the tshuvas Masas Binyamin, Simon Chavav, that's the makar. Maybe that's even the makar that I quoted back in that old shir about Shichrus. I would have to go check. But the 40 days and the meat and the wine and the pillows and the pretty similar to the one we had before, maybe slightly less severe. So that's the Divrei Chaim Taka still was going with the precedent, with the tradition, and maybe the latest one that I saw. I don't know if it's Taka the latest, but the Avnei Nezer Yedidei Simon Tafayin Ches has a tshuva from Tafresh Nun Hey. That's 1895. That's pretty recent, all things considered. And it describes another terrible accident that Shutfim hired a 14-year-old boy to travel with one of the Shutfim with birds, with chickens, to the border of Prussia, and to bring the horse back from the border. I guess maybe the Shutfim was going to cross the border, and then the boy will bring the horse back. The boy didn't know how to deal with a horse, so he tied the rope around the horse's neck. He tied the rope around his hand, and he's walking alongside the horse. And then the horse started running, and the boy couldn't keep up. So instead, he got knocked to the ground and got trampled. So, like I said, among other things, you get snapshots of the types of accidents that would befall people. Rahman al-Islam. So now the shaila is, are these seichrim, these shutfim, responsible? And he begins with Marival, and he gets into it. And I'm not going to get into all the pratim, but the maskana was, Nirid al kolpanim l'chayvim kolach ve'echad b'fnei atzmoi mem tainias. They're not each responsible to fast 40. Rak mishalshem b'neihem. Interesting use of mishalshem. I guess mishalshem could be used not in the sense of shalosh, but like a shalish. So it sounds like it's 20 and 20. But if one of them is more responsible, if one of them saw the boy tying his hand this way, which is a big mistake, not something that you should do with a horse, if he saw it happen and he was quiet, then maybe we should consider him fully responsible in his own right. So he should fast 40 and the other one should fast 20. If they do that, they can be doichel the tainus to the shorter days, and if it's very hard, they can be paid it in chai gedolim, which those familiar with Igeres teshuva and Tanya should be familiar. To be paid the tainus b'chai gedolim for every day, 18 big coins, osher yosef lefi oshrei, but better if they fast mamish. And it was, I guess, sounds like El Tishrei time, Yikosfu, Yichosmu, L'chaim Tovim. So this is a trip from Avinez, like I said, from, it's Yom Beis, Parshas Kiseitze, Tafesh Nun Hey. So it actually makes it interesting to ask, to look, when did it end? When did this tradition end? Because you see the Avinez, there's still the tail end of this Messiah of applying these Tikkunei Teshuva. And especially when did it end among Paiskim? Because I said it could be there's still Mekubalim doling out some kind of Tikkunei Teshuva. Now, I'm interested to know even other rabbis. Are other rabbis asked today, and what do they answer? It would be interesting to know. But of course, all of this is important context bechlal for understanding the Alter Rebbe's Igeres Teshuva, which I always say it's important to be familiar with this context so you can better appreciate where the Alter Rebbe is coming from, what premise the Alter Rebbe is accepting, what he's pushing back on. It's very important, and then ultimately you can understand what happened in Chabad with the Rebbe and which parts of Igeres Teshuva the Rebbe continued with, which parts the Rebbe said are not so shaykh. Obviously, when it comes to Tanesim, the Rebbe pretty much said Tanesim are completely off the table. But l'chayra by the Rebbe, l'chayra there should also be the union of pidyon being paid the Tanesim. I don't know who's being paid the Tanesim. Obviously, there's a difference in the Tanesim of the Arizal, which is stam for Avedas, which lavdafka. All those Avedas and all these Tikkunim would have been given by Rabbanim and Paiskim in Ashkenaz and Poilim 200, 300, 400 years ago. But some of the big ones like Ritzicha or manslaughter, those were clearly taken very seriously, and like we saw, the flip side was also that if you followed it, then no one can call you Ritzeach anymore. With that, we conclude the arichos on the Tikkunei Teshuva, which ultimately ended up being pretty much as long as I was trying to be makatzer, but I tried my best. What can I say? The next topic is interesting. It's about names. It's always a fascinating topic. Jewish names, Yiddish names. So this is the Chassam Sofer, Chelik Daled, and Ezra Beis, Simcha of Daled. It's written to the Rav, a couple of Verboy, as we'll see later, Verboys in Slovakia. And the Shaila had to do with the name Anshel. A fellow by the name of Asher Hamachuna Anshel. Right? So we know Asher and Anshel go together, and as we know Amal, the Hebrew name was your proper Hebrew Jewish name, and then you had this German name, Yiddish name, and you used your Asher and you used your Anshel depending on the situation. So Asher Hamachuna Anshel gave a get, and that's what they wrote. Everyone knew he was Asher Mechuna Anshel. All of a sudden, they chapzich, the Amol, he signs his name Antshel with a test. There's a test in there, Antshel. So they asked him, what's going on? So he said, I don't know how to spell my own name. Sometimes I spell it with a test, sometimes without. And so this Rav took it, God, errands, maybe there's a problem. But he was leaning towards saying, you don't need another get. So the Chassam Sofer says, you're right. I agree that you don't need another get. And even if we had to start over again, if we knew all we know now, we should only write Anshel. And even if he signed his whole life with a test, could be we treat it as inconsequential. Besides, checked, and many Mekaitis, being the Sadr Gittin, I never found, no one had mentioned to that point that there's ever a spelling of Antshel with a test. Adrab, I found one mucker, where it said that someone was Asher Mechuna Anshel with a test, and the Mechaber in this Chibur said that it's a mistake, it has to be Anshel without a test. So the one mucker where they acknowledge that the spelling exists, the Mechaber said, it's a mistake. That's not how you spell the name. Now, Chassam Sofer says he saw another teshuva where the shaila was, the Mesupik, why is Anshel the nickname for Asher? Which is often a question for these types of Yiddish names. Where do these names come from? So the Chassam Sefer says a very interesting thing. The Chassam Sefer says, I saw in a certain Sefer, and now I forgot where it is, that Anshel is Lashon Shamnunus v'chelev. That Anshel actually means fat. Belashon Ashkenaz, inschlicht. It means fat. In German, the word inschlicht. Based on the word inschlicht, you have the name Anshel. Why would you be calling someone a name Anshel, which means inschlicht, which means fat? Because it says Asher Shmin Alachmai. So that's the nickname for Asher. Asher, the fats. I don't want to make a litzanis. We could make it sound a little bit more funny, but that's the nickname according to the Chassam Sefer. So now that we know the linguistic origins of the name, so then that would prove that the test has no place here. It's not whatever Antshel with a test might mean. That's not what the word means. The word means inschlicht, so there's no test. So that's an example. Sometimes people sign their names incorrectly, and we come to them and we say, "Sorry, man, you're just spelling your name wrong. Stop doing that." So that's what the Chassam Sefer says at the beginning of this tshuva. Now, this Chassam Sefer is actually quoted by the Pesach Tshuva and Ibn Ezer, Siman Kuf Chavtes, where there's the Shem is Gittin. So in Asher Anshel, the Pesach Tshuva Taka quotes this Chassam Sefer. I searched a bit, and I did not see that anyone ever stellt sich to explain, to identify where the Chassam Sefer, which Sefer the Chassam Sefer saw this in. It'd be very interesting to know. Maybe it's not a Sefer Kodesh. Maybe it's some non-Kodesh Sefer, which itself would be interesting and intriguing, where he could have seen such a thing. It's very fascinating. I didn't find it. I didn't find this Anshel Inschlicht idea anywhere. I didn't see anyone stung sich an the Chassam Sefer. I didn't find it myself anywhere. So I don't know. And it's very interesting that the Chassam Sefer says this. It's quoted in a few places now in different forms of the Chassam Sefer. Of course, Anshel is somewhat notable. It's not. Sometimes you find Yiddish names and no one's heard of them already in the last 100 years. But no, this is a name that's sort of still well known. Maybe particularly notable that Mayor Antshel Rothschild, which I think his name was Mayor and his father's name was Anshel, and then his son's name was Anshel Mayor Rothschild, so his son's name was Anshel. Interestingly, in German and English, it's spelled with an M, Amshel. The Chassam Sefer is saying the Belashon Ashkenaz Inschlicht, so I looked it up, and today in German it would be spelled Unschlitt. Unschlitt in German means tallow, but if you look, you'll see that earlier forms of the word sometimes had the ch in it, inschlicht. Either way, it shouldn't be negeh. Anshel doesn't have a chaf in it anyway. However, even though Chassam Sefer says this is the taich, however, I've seen mumchim, the history of Jewish names, Yiddish names, they say that you can trace the names. You can go look through all the records of Jews in German lands, going all the way back to the 1100s or whatever. And then you start seeing names pop up, and then you trace the name, and you see how the name develops over time. And if you do this for this name, we see that the name began as Anselm or Anshel. And Anselm is a famous German name. There are famous German goyim also named Anselm. And what does Antshel mean? They explain that Ants in German, Shirashim, means God. And helm is actually a little bit, the Shadish you have in English as well, helmet, protection. So Antshel means God's protection. That was the original name. And the first Jews with these names, that was how they wrote it. That was how they spelled it, all the way back to, 1300s maybe. And then also at an early point, you start seeing that in addition to Anshel or Anselm, you have Anshel or Ansel. So that would be the more historically accurate name. And sometimes you find people give, it's called a folk etymology, Hezber Lemafreya, so that Anshel is Lashon Shamnunas, Lashon Shmin Alachmai. If we're allowed to, since the Chassam Sefer says it b'shem Sefer Echad Ke'es Nishkach Mimeni, if we're allowed to suggest that perhaps there's another taich, so it would seem that this other taich might be more historically correct. But even Lafi, this Mahalach would still support the Chassam Sefer's point that Lafi, the history of this name and the meaning of this name, there's also no test. So the point stands that there's no test here. Asher Anshel is still a name that's out there. I think it's more in like those who hail from an Ashkenazi background or Hungarian background, which has an Ashkenazi influence. Like I don't know any Russian Asher Anshels, but it's still out there for sure. And interestingly, if you search, you'll actually find that some still, or have in the last 100, 200 years, have spelled it Antshel with a tes. So it's not just in this teshuva Chasam Sefer. This spelling was out there, and I'll get back to this in a bit. But then the Chasam Sefer gets pulled into this discussion initiated by this Rav, the couple, that you know why he spells it tes. He looked into it, and he says he thinks the reason why he spelled it with a tes is because this guy lived in a town, and there were a lot of goyim in the town. And the goyim in the town, they can't pronounce things exactly, depending on their language and all that. They can't pronounce things exactly the way you pronounce it. So when his name is Anshel, they pronounce it Antshel. Because he kept on being called that by the local goyim, so he started spelling it that way sometimes. But the couple had said that the rule is we follow the Yiddish name, not the Goyish name. Some Sefer says it's not so pashut. Depends what context we're talking about. There's a marker that says when you have a Meshumad, so a Meshumad had a Yiddish name when he was a Yid, and he has a Goyish name when he was a Goy, then we ignore the Goyish name because that's when he has that name, and it's Nishkan Yid B'chal. And in the Yiddish context, he only has a Yiddish name. But if a person, as a Yid, has a Yiddish name and a Goyish name, then the premise is you do have to use the Goyish name. Interestingly, the Chasam Sefer gets into the whole thing here about Yochanan, that Yochanan is John. So it's those who know that, but it's interesting to see the Chasam Sefer talking about Derech Mashal. Yochanan, the Romans call it Yohan, Yohanus, or even Yanai. So he says Yanai was a Roman name that Jews used. You see, it's man by Sheni that the Yidden called other Yidden Yanai. So that's one gather. But then you have Yohan and Yohanos, that's a Zah Goyish name. Yidden never use it among themselves. So this fits into this discussion as to using a Yiddish Goyish name versus a Goyish name. It's interesting. I'm not getting into the details, but it's interesting that Chasam Sefer mentions this point. But he says, in this case, if he wouldn't sign his name that way, Afal Pisha, Slovakian, alluding to the fact that he's in the Slovakian area, the Slovakian call him that, then he wouldn't care, because Anshel is a Goyish name that Jews use. But now that he himself started calling himself Antshel, so then it's not such a mistake. If it was a stupid mistake with no basis, then ignore it. But here there is a basis. Goyim are calling him this, so it has a basis. And then the Yid started using it, so he gave it the imprimatur of a Goyish name that Yidden use. So maybe now he just invented a new name, Antshel. So that would be the svara. But nearly is daiti, and that's Lamaisa, we don't have to be concerned. He says, ultimately, it's not a real difference. It's a mispronunciation. They can't pronounce Anshel without a tes, and they insert a tes. So Bazoi, that's more in nickname territory. If you take a name and you play around with it, and you add a letter, you take away a letter, that's all nickname territory. So Antshel is the Slovak nickname for Anshel. It doesn't mean that you just invented and created a new name. And in terms of signing, he doesn't always sign his name consistently that way. If he signed his name consistently that way, then maybe at some point it establishes a new name, a new spelling. But since he himself is inconsistent, then we defer to the standard official spelling on the books and all the Sifrei Gittin and Mamela. That's his Pesach. I'm going to be Mekatzer here now. And he signs Yoim Dalet Zayin Tamuz Tov Kuf Ayin Vav. That would be 1816. As a postscript, I'll say it's interesting. I found that in the Kavitz Hechel Hira from the Rabbonim of the Brandstaffer family, so in the Hechel Hira from the Yotavshin Ayin Tes, page 281, 82, he has a shaila there. A younger man has a ksuba. The younger man's father's name is Asher Anshel, and in the ksuba they wrote Anshel, the normal spelling, Aleph Nun Shin. But his father is makbid. His father always spells his name. When he is chosim his name, he always spells a tes. That's how it's Kabbalah, that he knows that's his name. The younger man spotted, but the Baal Mesader Aksuba wrote it the normal way that everyone spells it. So the young man wanted to know if he has a problem with the kseva. So the Rav Ransdorfer, I think Rav Moshe Ransdorfer, says he looked into it and he found this Fardim, quoting the Chassam Sefer, he found this whole thing. The Chassam Sefer was saying that you could ignore Antshel. He says, however, Chassam Sefer said so based in that specific context that there had been no documentation of Antshel with a test, or there was one, but the source said it's a tos, and then it's just the goyim in the town and all these mitigating factors. But Dr. Brandstoffer, however, by now, it seems like there have been further developments. You have a Yid now who holds and believes and spells his name, Dafka with a test. So at this point, it seems to have turned into sort of its own name or its own specific spelling. So Kentaka Zayin, that the din will change. And there are other tshuvas on it that I saw as well. If you search Anshel, Antshel, you'll see different tshuvas, different places. My feeling in these scenarios is that often these tshuvas, they end up sounding very, very technical, very pilpuldik. But if you zoom out and you use, especially if you have the historical information about the name, I think it's possible to recast these discussions in more general logical terms. But the svaras hold up. It sort of does depend on what exactly happened in that scenario. As the Chassam Sefer explained. Since we're already on names, the next one is also on names. This is Hari B'Samim. I believe I've mentioned it before. The Hari B'Samim Chelik Gimel, Madurat Lisa Simen Gimel. This is also a tshuva from Zayin Tamuz. Yom Daled Zayin Tamuz, Tafresh Nun Daled Stri. This is to a Rav Chaim Shmuel Shor in Bucharest. And here's an interesting thing. Guy wanted to divorce his wife. The Rav asked him his name. He said, "My name is Pesach." And the Rav said, "Yeah, your name is Pesach. You don't have a proper name. Maybe, when they call you to the Torah, maybe they call you Pesachya." The guy said, "I never heard of Pesachya. Who is? He never gets an aliyah. So the aliyah test doesn't work for this guy." And the Mesader Haget, this doesn't smell right to me. His name is Pesach, not Pesachya. Can't be. I think his name is Pesachya. So he wrote Pesachya, the Miskadi Pesach. And then people said, what is this a kosher to get? You wrote a name that has no basis. And this is a very interesting mystery. The mystery of the name Pesach. As we'll see, this Rav was not the only one. There was a very prevalent assumption that Pesach is apparently a nickname for Pesachya, and that no one is just called Pesach. This was a very common assumption in the 1800s. Interestingly, he says, if you look in all the classic Sifrei Shemus Gittin, they never mention the name Pesach. He says, I remember that episode in the Get Pasha that mentions Pesach. I don't have the Sefer. And if you look in the Chumas Hadesh and Piskei Marai, it mentions that the Pesach of Krems wrote something, signed something. So you see that the name Pesach was among Ashkenazim going back to the Chumas Hadesh, which wouldn't necessarily prove whether that was the Hebrew name or not, but the name exists. The name has a history, but like very spotty documentation apparently in the Sifrei Shemus Gittin. The Hari B'Samim, if we analyze Pesach as a word, the word Pesach and the word Pesachya are two different things. And in fact, in Tanakh, we do find a name that's spelled Pei Samach Ches in Nehemiah, but there it's with the nikud Paseach. And no one pronounces it that way. If we're going to claim that's the name, no one calls anyone Paseach. But maybe it is the name, maybe it's the biblical name, and the nikud change. So maybe that would be one way of looking at it. So in this case, the guy says he never heard of Pesachya. Now, even if he was called Pesachya when he was born, but no one ever called him that, or no one even knows about it anymore, so that means it's Ois name. However, if we knew for a fact that he was once called Pesachya, and now he's no longer called that, he's only known as Pesach, and now the get was written with Pesachya and Pesach, then maybe B'mokin Igun, we could say that maybe it's kosher. However, in this case, no one has any proof, any documentation about Pesachya. It's just the Rav's insistence that can't be your name is just Pesach. Your name had to be Pesachya. This is literally zero evidence. So it's Shini Hashem Mamish Pasal Mederaisa. I don't see any way to be Mahapich B'schusay of the Rav Mesader. The Rav Mesader really messed us up. That's how he concludes the tshuva. That's it. So what's fascinating is that we find there are multiple shilas teshuvas that have the same premise. Divrei Chaim, Even Ezer, Chelik Beis Sim Kufnan Aleph, writing to the Mendel Panet of Dej, that there's a get, that in this case it was the guy's father. This guy's father, everyone calls him Pesach. When this guy's father gets an aliyah, this guy's father did get aliyahs, the Chazan would say, when the guy would, the Megadish would get aliyahs, and when he gets aliyahs, he gets called by his father's name. Whenever they would call the Megadish to the Torah, the Chazan would say, Yamud, so ben Reb Pesachyahu, with a vav at the end. So everyone knows his father's name is Pesach, but the Chazan, the Shamash, the whatever you want to call him, he calls him here the Chazan, calls him ben Reb Pesachyahu. But the Megadish himself has no knowledge that his father's name is Pesachya. They searched, they asked around, no one knows anything about Pesachya. Only Pesach, everyone knows that. And in fact, they even found one guy who was used to sit next to his father in shul, and so he would hear how they called him up. He says, I remember clearly that they never called him Pesachyahu to the Torah. So this here they're asking before they wrote the get. Well, what should we write? So the Divrei Chaim also starts with the same observation that there's no sefer on Gittin that mentions Pesach. And the name Pesachya, they all say to write without a vav, which is an interesting discussion you have for many of these Yud Kei Vav names. How do you write it? What's the name? So in this case, they all say to write it without a vav. The name is Pesachya, not Pesachyahu. He says that itself is a proof that this Chazan calling him up is making stuff up. He's calling him Ben Reb Pesachyahu. Where'd you even get that from? That's not even a name. Who's called that? He says, in these cases, we have precedent that you ignore the Shliach Tzibur. If he calls him up, he's making stuff up. That's Shkedayat to anything. In fact, we have an aid that says his father was never called Pesachya, and the Chazaka and the aid fit with each other. That if there's zero evidence that his father was ever called Pesachya, then you can't just assume that his name is Pesachya. It seems like this Chazan has retroactively made up that this guy's father's name is Pesachyahu Kafirat Tzayne. How can we make the fake name into the Iker? Therefore, we should go with what everyone seems to know, what everyone thinks, and just write Pesach and ignore the whole Pesachyahu thing. Now, the Divrei Chaim says that maybe if you could have the possibility of giving two Gittin, maybe you should write one with Pesach, one with Pesachya, Mechona Pesach. But Be'emes, even if it was possible, the whole get would be completely unnecessary. How can this Chazan make up a name? Everyone knows his name is Pesach. And he adds a bit more. So we see that this issue kept on cropping up, that there were people whose names were known to be Pesach, and then other people were insisting that, Pesach, your name is Pesachya. Your name is Pesachya. Whether it's the Baal Megadish, whether it's the Chazan in the Shul, added an extra flourish of Pesachyahu. But interestingly, this is not the only such case, or the only such cases. Another marker is the Teres Chesed of Lublin. Teres Chesed, Even Ezer, Simon Chav Zayin. Get the Baal Megadish, his name is Pesach. That was what he was called as a baby. That's what everyone calls him. It says, the person asking the Shaila believes the Shmuah that you heard that Pesach is taken from Pesachya. And sometimes the Shatz and Shul also call them up as Pesachya. So everyone keeps on claiming and insisting, your name is not Pesach, your name is Pesachya. So Teres Chesed, Lafini is deity, there's no suffix, that Pesach is its own name and it's not connected to Pesachya. And we find Teres Chesed was a big bucky, more than some of the other Pesachim, and he had a memory for these things. So he says more confidently, we find this name L'Roiv B'Kamas, that they signed their name Pesach. And that's what they were called by everyone. One of them is the Mechaber Sefer Kemach Pesach, which he named after himself. And he's mentioned in the Tshuvas Mekoim Shmuel Simon Chav Ches. And at the end of the Sefer Pardes Larashi Tufus Amsterdam, there are a number of Tshuvas Meharavra Pesach, and in other Svar. And in the Sefer Get Pashot, maybe this is Taka what the Hari B'Sam remembered. You remember that this is Get Pashot. And Get Pashot, at the end, they were Maitik, Shemus Gittin from a certain Beistin. It's a Rosh Tevis. I have to look up who the Beistin, whose Beistin it was. But in the list of Shemus Gittin from that Beistin, which sounds like an interesting documentary source, there were two Gittin of someone with a Megarish's name was Pesach. And presumably, if the Teres Chesed is quoting it, so we see clearly that they were known as Pesach and not Pesachya. It didn't say Pesachya was known as Pesach. There's literal documentation of Gittin signed by, not signed, but with the name is Pesach. He's also Mitzayin that there's the Bakiyas of the Teres Chesed. The Bakiva Eger. In Tosis of the Bakiva Eger on Mishnayis, the end of Peah, brings Epis Maisa that happened in Lissa. It doesn't bring the Maisa, I didn't look it up. But from that Maisa there, we see that there are people whose name is Pesach, and that name was written in a get. It seems like it was maybe incidental to the story there, but the Teres Chesed pulled that detail from his memory as well. Plus, he mentions that in Nehemiah, we have the name Poseach, and even though it's different Nekudas, but he also mentions this Swara that the Nekudas changed. Gamaz Manenu, he says, the reality is, Matthias says, there are many people whose name is Pesach, and there's no Shaykhus to Pesachya. So the Teres Chesed is very confident, and he has, clearly he had, like I'm saying, he had this Bekiyas, he had this knack. There are some Gedolim, some Poiskim, that their Iker Inyan is Avana, Dias, Pilp, whatever it is. They're not bucky in names from random Svar. Yeah, the Teres Chesed, you see, had this well-rounded Bekiyas, Yedias, knowledge, where he was able to marshal all of these facts together very confidently. In this case, the Shots called him Pesachya a few times, but he never used it. And he told the Shots himself that his name is Pesach, and the Shots kept on insisting because there was this loud trend in the 1800s of people saying, no, your name is Pesachya. I'm telling you, I know better than you, your name is Pesachya. So the Shots was ignoring him and calling him Pesachya. Pshita, that it's the Shots' mistake, because he's one of the Toyim, he's one of these people who goes around thinking that Pesach means your name is Pesachya. And it's not true. Teres Chesed is very confident. And you and the Ship, because the person asking the Shaila who's also convinced of this, that you and the Shots are all in the same boat. He had the mistake, and you have the mistake. You're both convinced. You're both wrong. And he says, we have precedent. We have similar cases. He says there are cases where the Marshal says that Lazer and Lazar, Eliezer and Elazar, were often confused by the Chazan calling people up. And he quotes another Makar, the Knesset Yecheskel, talks about how Chizkiah and Yecheskel would, or maybe Chatzkel also, would be mixed up. And the Chazan make a mistake. There's precedent for this. And when we say to follow how he's called to the Torah is in a normal case where he himself, you don't know his name in a normal situation day to day, which we know ourselves happens all the time. You have a friend, you know your friend for 20 years, you think you know his name, and then all of a sudden when they call up his full name, oh wow, I didn't know he had a full name. So when everyone's on the same page about how he's called to the Torah, then that's a good source. But if the Chazan's just making stuff up, then that's a terrible source. Why would that have any halachic standing? So Teres Chesed says, "In roya laharach yoser," that speaks for itself, and that's that. So there's this interesting conundrum here of what's going on. Based on what I have also seen from those who are experts on the names, one of the big names in this tchum is Alexander Beider, or Sasha Beider. My understanding is that I think he lists Pesachya as one of the names that arose in the Czech lands, the Bohemian lands. He has a whole list, a whole class of names, including many interesting Hebrew names, that you could sort of identify the history and the story behind the name. Names tell a story. So if someone has a name, Menucha or Nechama or Pesachya or Pesach, you can sort of trace and say, okay, this name actually tells us that maybe their family comes from a certain place in Europe at a certain time, because only certain regions had certain names, which is very interesting. And it wasn't 100% clear to me, but it seemed that there is documentation of both Pesachya and Pesach. And as the Teres Chesed focused on the name Pesach, we do have the name Pesach going back pretty far. So they are two separate names, but there is some kind of mystery here, why so many people in the 1800s were convinced of this. And it's interesting that why would the Sefer Shemus Gittin not mention Pesach, right? Now, one of the reasons why they wouldn't mention Pesach would be if perhaps they assumed that Pesach is just a kitzer of Pesachya, and then the rule is that if it's mamish just a kitzer, then you don't write it. So that would make things, that's what makes things a little tricky here. But of course, the Metzias is, as we saw earlier with Anshel as well, that things can also change. It can start off one way. So let's say maybe it started off as two separate names. But then somewhere along the way, people with the name Pesachya were also given the nickname Pesach. The fact that there's a name Pesach at all is interesting, right? Is it this biblical name of Pesach? That I find a little hard it just doesn't sit well. Poskim like to, if they find a biblical source, they like to say that's the source. But historically, I don't know if that sits so well. But we know there's also the name Nissen. There are these interesting names, and I think, like I said, I think it's associated with the with Czech lands, Bohemia. Some of these interesting names. So independently, Pesach could have also turned into a nickname for Pesachya. And there are some established cases. We know for a fact, you can look it up. There are certain people, where they'll write, his name was Pesachya and he was known as for Pesach. I'm assuming that, at least in some of those cases, it wasn't just people making it up based on the fact that he was known as Pesach. I would have to hope and assume that some of them were real. So it seems like that was a thing, to the extent that, and maybe people also thought that Pesach was a funny name. So I think just like with Menachem Nochem, where Nochem sounds like a biblical name, but I think B'Yesodai, historically, it's probably more of just like a kitzer of Menachem for short, Nochem, which sounds identical to the biblical name. So it could be that was how they were processing it and saying, Pesach, that's not a name, it's probably Pesachya for short. So multiple things could be true, but it's definitely a very interesting mystery. Obviously today, there are some well-known Pesachs. We can mention it. Everyone knows for Pesach Kron, and never heard that his name is Pesachya. Presumably his name is Taka just Pesach. I don't have any other names off the top of my head, but L'chaira, there are people whose name is just Pesach, and that goes back 600 years, and it's true till today. And there were some people who were Pesachya Pesach, but it's so interesting how there was like this, kept on happening over and over again, that people were deciding for other people and telling them, no, your name can't just be, your name must be Pesachya. That itself is a fascinating phenomenon, the sociology of people deciding for other people what their name is. I have one more tshuva here, but at this point it's really late and very long. We've gone very long as well, but I'll just mention it in 60 seconds. And there's a Kan Aaron Chelik Alf Siman Nun is a tshuva Yom Hey Zayin Tamuz Tofesh Tzaddik Pinsk 1930 to Rabbi Kalman held a rav in Schatz in Romania. And they were talking about how in the shul there they had put up these murals, paintings of full people, kol hagof, yadayim, raglayim, including the kevis. And so this was considered like a pirza. And this Ganaran takes a very chumradik stance that it's taka aser, and it's tsuras adam, that's aser, whole discussion, boilet, shikeya, tzava. And which is its own interesting topic. We're definitely not going to get into it now. He takes a stringent view. Plus, as the Yaris Dvash, Renis and Apeshitz said that you shouldn't have any images of people in your home. And there were earlier Makaitis already, but art in the shul, and that you can't have such art in the shul. So therefore, it's Nachin Ma'oid to be Mevatel Kotzun Ribat Midrash. And he ends off with a plea to the Gaboyim, Achai, Alna Tareyu, it's an Isser Gamur. And it's also a reform. It's what the reformer do. So that's Bekitzer, what's going on here. And I'll just share my thoughts, my general thoughts, which is that first of all, there's like clearly that ship has sailed. Clearly, people aren't necessarily putting up pictures of people in shul, but the whole argument was that Tzir Adam Bechlal is a problem. The show is just extra detail, the cherry on top, but he's still going with this mahalach that tziyurim are aser. Now we know that in the early 1900s there were many charedim, tzaddikim, who taka seemed to be makbid, not to allow themselves to be photographed, not to have pictures in their home. There was a very strong, just a very strong precedent, a very strong default. Maybe you could even say taboo, etc. That pictures are not Jewish. It's not a Yiddish azach. And then at some point, that ship sailed. Now, if you return to the question and just examine the halachic sources, so then you sort of have this question of, if everyone's doing it, should we just, if there's one shita in Rishonim, one mahalach in the Gemara, should we just say, we found a heter and that's it? When do we say that? When do we say, look at all the dais that seem to aser. Ultimately, sometimes it seems that the Metzias, what people do, is Kevea, who we hold like. But even that's interesting, because sometimes it's a pirza, and the Rabbanim keep on saying, no, it's a pirza, it's wrong. And sometimes the pirza becomes the de facto psak, and then that shapes the psak halacha. Interestingly, I found that in the magazine Hamavaser Torani, the Torah supplement Hamavaser, number 183, Shlach Tavshanayim Beis, someone wrote a letter, a full-page letter, about this kpeda that Tzaddik Amo had not to take pictures. And in the last door, until a few years ago, the Vishnitz Monsey Rebbe, I think, or maybe one, now I'm not remembering if it's the one who was the previous one, or maybe one of his sons now, is up as one of the, maybe Taka even one of them now. He wears sunglasses, I think, because he doesn't want to be photographed, his full face. They're keeping this kpeda alive. So this person, I think Taka Famansi, was giving an overview of this topic, and this kpeda that is considered a relic sort of ties into this whole halachic discussion. And he's mitzayin to a number of makaydas, including this teshuva, and he mentions that Reb Kalman held was a Vishnitz chassid. So interestingly, there's like a Vishnitz link to this mahalach. But really, this is a big topic: the history of Jews and art and depictions of people, whether in Shol or in Kisvei Yad. And those who are familiar with the Haggadahs, with art, are familiar that there are some Haggadahs that don't depict people, or the people don't have faces, or there's the famous birds Haggadah, where the people have bird faces, and it's debated what the reason is, but it seems like one of the possibilities is that there was a kpeda not to draw people. And of course, the history of art goes back to after Bayis Sheni. There are sites in Israel of synagogues with art, but then the shaila is, were they following halacha? Were they fully rabbinized Jews or not? It seems like for a long tkufa, we look in the Arabian lands, it doesn't seem that there was much art, and certainly there were kahilas, whole tkufas, places, times where there were no depictions of people in Jewish writings and Jewish art. Well, there was no Jewish art. Usually there's some form of art to some extent. How you design your shul could be a form of art, but just the architecture. But it seems like there were times and places where it's very clear that people were being nizer and being makbid not to depict people. I think I was looking into the Haggadah's question, and I think I read one of the Chaykim wrote that you could tell at some point there was mamash a chiluk between East Germany and West Germany. That in the Rhine region they did one thing, and in Regensburg they did something else, and maybe there was local art influences. But you could mamash tell by looking at either way, by looking at the city, by looking at the location, or by looking at the art in Haggadah, you can see the link between the location and whether they were nizer in this inyan or not. So this is a real fascinating historical question in Parsha. There's also the question of should there be art in Shul, whether it's people or not people, whether it could be other things, it could be an aryeh, it could be malachim, which are also things maybe you're not allowed to draw, or there's a strong basis to say you're not allowed to draw, or drawing the mazalas. And there's interesting tshuva of Cook actually about mazalas and shuls. But we have very old shuls. There are shuls in Poland that were a few hundred years old, that were built very beautifully, and they had mazalas in them, or the machzeirim had drawings of mazalas in them. So at this point, we've sort of gotten inured, if that's the right word. We've become numb to the questions. We're inundated with pictures and art and depictions of people, maybe not in shul per se, although maybe there are some shuls that have depictions of people in the stained glass or whatever. But just the fact that we have it all over the place. And I think in Williamsburg, there you can still find certain books, things for kids, where they don't draw in the face, the very, very rudimentary drawings, not professional art, and where they don't draw in the face. It seems like there was a streak of still trying to be makbid on that among some in Williamsburg. I don't know exactly which group, which people. But this is an example of something where for hundreds or thousands of years, to a great extent, even in places where the Haggadahs had art. But the Haggadah is commissioned by a gvir from an artist, so maybe they're being mekel. But most other Yidden in their community wouldn't have had books with art, with depictions of people necessarily, or maybe if it was printed, maybe some Haggadahs were printed with depictions of people, but it's not boile, it's not shekeya, it's not seva. So these are all details that have to be worked out. But this idea that we take for granted that we're, like I said, inundated with depictions and colorful and realistic, this is something that's relatively new, most of it. And we have to imagine a world where this wasn't what people were experiencing. Certainly the full color, realistic pictures of people. And this paid against pictures was back when photography was black and white. The fact that standard pictures are color now also takes it to a whole nother level that is only really more negay in the last 40 years. So even something that became accepted 100 years ago, let's say the black and white got accepted, but the black and white is still black and white. And then suddenly, overnight, the pictures turned to color. And at this point, we're already doing what we do, and we're not even questioning it. Interestingly, I've observed that this is negay to the shaila of depictions of women, which is considered more of a tznius question. But when it comes to depictions of women, there's also this word of color. There's a difference in color. The big dates of oinen of the woman is the mind of the Rebbe, to reveal sinner about the picture of the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbe seemed to be saying that in the picture of the Rebbetzin, you're lacking a lot of the conditions to make it problematic. One of them is that it's a black and white picture. It's not tziv oinen. But taka around that time, the early 90s, somewhere in the 90s, it became easy and cheap for even small-time publications to have color photos. So suddenly, the question of including pictures of women shifted from one of black and white to pictures in color. So perhaps it's not fully a coincidence that the chumrah, those being machmir more, which the way I remember it is that here in America, it sort of started with Mishpacha coming to American shores in 2004. That was the first magazine that I recall, the first English magazine. Obviously, the Yiddish magazines have their own history, papers and magazines, but in the English-speaking world, the English-speaking from world, it seems the Jewish Observer, Confronts magazine, not that they're necessarily in the same league, but there were pictures of women. And then Mishpacha stopped, and it was like the Israeli influence, as I understood it at the time. But Yesh Leimar, that Country Yassi magazine and Jewish Observer were still black and white, I think, even when I was growing up. Mishpacha was a full-color magazine. So I don't know if that was their expressed cheshbon, but the fact that pictures have turned to color does actually change the calculus. So in the case of stam pictures, representation of people, being over on that issue, that doesn't seem to have changed anyone's behavior. Things just keep on being introduced and we accept them. But interestingly, when it comes to the tznius thing, perhaps that is an invisible factor that hasn't been fully acknowledged. Anyway, so this is an interesting piece of history where the Zkan Aaron is reacting to the cherem in the shul, but he's invoking the isser of making it tzuras adam. And with that, we've gone very, very long. We've gone on ba'arichos here, but hopefully it's interesting, both the Tikkun teshuva, the Anshel, the Pesach, and the tzuras adam, and all that is mistaif from that. And enjoy the Motzei Zayin Tamuz.